Let me ask you to look at these two images because we're about to talk about the worldview question. I think this is a provocative way to begin to think about that because what you see are two images that look somewhat similar to each other, but they stand in for somewhat different worldview perspectives. This being, of course, a beautiful stained glass window, the rose window in Westminster Cathedral. And this is an unusual view of DNA. Not looking at it from the side, but looking down the long axis of DNA, so you see that radial pattern. And the question that many people pose, and which I pose to you tonight, is, okay, those are two worldviews, the scientific and the spiritual. Do you have to choose? Do you have to basically throw in your lot with one or the other and neglect the other one? Or is there a possibility here of being someone who could merge these two? Not necessarily building a firewall between them, but actually having both of those perspectives within your own experience. I think many people today are arguing that these worldviews are at war and that there is no way to reconcile them. That has not been my experience, and that's what I particularly would like to share this evening, and then I hope we will have some time for questions from those of you who would like to pursue that in one way or another. So I think I owe you at this point a little bit more of a description about my spiritual perspective. I described my scientific pathway. How is it that I stand up here before you this evening in a distinguished university and talk about being a believer in God? Many of you might have assumed that the only scientists who were those who learned faith in childhood would have it later on, but that's not my story. I was raised in a family that was wonderfully unconventional. My father had been a folk song collector in the 1930s in North Carolina. After the war, he and my mother did the 60s thing, except it was still the 40s. And I don't think it involved drugs, but they did buy a dirt farm and tried to live off the land. And that didn't go very well. I discovered that that was not a credible way to have enough income to serve a growing family. I was born on that farm. By that time, my father had gone back to teaching at the local college, and my mother had started writing plays. And they founded a theater in the grove of oak trees up above our farmhouse, which I'm happy to say is about to have its 54th consecutive summer season. So I got raised in this wonderful mix of ideas, of music, of theater, the arts. My mother taught me at home until the 6th grade, which was also very unconventional in the 1950s. And she taught me to love the experience of learning new things. But the one thing I didn't learn much about was faith. My parents didn't really denigrate religion, but they didn't find it very relevant. And so when I got to college, I had those conversations that one has. Even though I might have had some spiritual glimmers along the way, they quickly disappeared in those dormitory conversations where there's always an atheist who's determined to put forward that argument about why your faith is actually flawed, and mine wasn't even there at all. So it was pretty easy for the resident atheist to dismiss my leanings of any sort. I was probably an agnostic at that point, although I didn't know the word. And then I went off to graduate school and studied physical chemistry and very much was involved in a theoretical approach to trying to understand the behavior of atoms and molecules. And my faith really then rested upon second-order differential equations, which are pretty cool, by the way, but just the same, I became increasingly of a reductionist mode and a materialist mode, and I had even less tolerance then for hearing information of a spiritual sort and considered that to be irrelevant. Some appropriately should be cast off information left over from an earlier time. But then I had a change of heart as far as what I wanted to do professionally. I loved what I was doing in chemistry, but I discovered that biology, which I had pretty much neglected, actually had a lot going for it. Recombinant DNA was being invented. There was some chance here that we might actually begin to understand how life works at a fundamental level. And realizing that that was a real calling for me, and also that I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a researcher or a practitioner, I went to medical school. That had not been part of my life plan, and it's still rather amazing. The medical school let me in with that story, but they did. I arrived in medical school as an atheist, but it didn't last. Because in that third year of medical school, I found myself, as one does, taking care of patients. Wonderful people with terrible illnesses. Illnesses that medicine was not going to be able to solve in many instances. People who saw the approach of death, knowing what was coming, and to my surprise, seemed to be at peace about it because of their faith. That was puzzling. And as I tried to imagine myself in that situation, I knew I would not be at peace. I would be terrified. And that was a bit disturbing, but I tried to put it out of my mind until one afternoon when a wonderful elderly woman who was my patient, who had very advanced heart disease that we had run out of options for and who knew her life was coming to a close, told me in a very simple, sincere way about her faith and how that gave her courage and hope and peace about what was coming. And as she finished that description, she looked at me sort of quizzically as I sat there silently, feeling a little embarrassed, and she said, "Doctor, I've told you about my faith, and we've talked about my family, and I thought maybe you might say something." Oh. And then she asked me the most simple question. "Doctor, what do you believe?" Nobody had ever asked me that question before, not like that, not in such a simple, sincere way. And I realized I didn't know the answer. I felt uneasy. I could feel my face flushing. I wanted to get out of there. The ice was cracking under my feet. Everything was all of a sudden muddled by this simple question, "Doctor, what do you believe?" So that troubled me, and I thought about it a little bit and realized what the problem was. I was a scientist, or at least I thought I was, and scientists are supposed to make decisions after they look at the data, after they look at the evidence. I had made a decision that there was no God, and I'd never really thought about looking at the evidence. That didn't seem like a good thing. It was the decision that I wanted the answer to be, but I had to admit I didn't really know whether I had chosen the answer on the basis of reason or whether because it was a convenient form of perhaps willful blindness to the evidence. I wasn't sure there was any evidence, but I figured I'd better go find out because I didn't want to be in that spot again. So what did I do? Well, I figured there are those world religions. What do they believe? I better find out. And I tried to read through some of those sacred texts, and I got totally confused and frustrated. And there was no Wikipedia to help me either. It's much easier now. There's even a book on the shelf called World Religions for Dummies, but they didn't have that then either. So at a loss, I knocked on the door of a minister who lived down the road from me in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and said, "I don't know what these people are talking about, but I figure it's time for me to learn. So, okay, you must be a believer. At least I hope you are. You're a minister. Let me ask you some questions." So I asked him a bunch of probably blasphemous questions, and he was gracious about that. And after a while said, "You're on a journey here trying to figure out what's true. You're not the first one. And in fact, I've got a book here written by somebody who went on that same journey from an academic perspective. In fact, it was a pretty distinguished Oxford scholar. He found around him there were people who were believers, and he was puzzled about that, and he set about to try to figure out why people believe and figured that he could shoot them down. And, well, why don't you read the book and see what happened? So he pulled this little book off the shelf, and I took it home and began to read. And in the first 2 or 3 pages, I realized that my arguments against faith were really those of a schoolboy. They had no real substance. And the thoughtful reflections of this Oxford scholar, whose name, of course, is C.S. Lewis, made me realize there was a great depth of thinking and reason that could be applied to the question of God. And that was a surprise. I had imagined faith and reason were at opposite poles. And here was this deep intellectual who was convincing me quickly, page by page, that actually reason and faith go hand in hand, though faith has the added component of revelation. Well, I had to learn more about that. Over the course of the next year, kicking and screaming most of the way, because I did not want this to turn out the way that it seemed to be turning out, I began to realize that the evidence for the existence of God, while not proof, was actually pretty interesting. And it certainly made me realize that atheism would no longer be for me an acceptable choice, that it was the least rational of the options. I won't go through the whole chronology as it actually happened, but let me summarize for you the kinds of arguments that ultimately brought me around to the position of recognizing that belief in God was an entirely satisfying intellectually event, but also something that I was increasingly discovering I had a spiritual hunger for. And interestingly, some of the pointers to God had been in front of me all along, coming from the study of nature, and I hadn't really thought about them, but here they were. Here's one which seems like an obvious statement, but maybe it's not so obvious. There is something instead of nothing. No reason that should be. This phrase of Wigner, the Nobel laureate in physics, caught my eye because I had been involved, of course, as a graduate student working with quantum mechanics with Schrödinger's equation. And one of the things that had appealed to me so much about mathematics and physics and chemistry was how it was that this particular kind of depiction of matter and energy works. I mean, it really works well. And a theory that is correct often turns out to be simple and beautiful. And why should that be? Why should mathematics be so unreasonably effective in describing nature? There's the Big Bang. The fact that the universe had a beginning, as virtually all scientists are now coming to the conclusion, about 13.7 billion years ago, in an unimaginable singularity, where the universe, smaller than a golf ball, suddenly appeared and then began flying apart and has been flying apart ever since. And we can calculate that singularity by noticing just how far those galaxies are receding from us and things like the background microwave radiation, the echo of that Big Bang. And of course that presents a difficulty because our science cannot look back beyond that point. And it seems that something came out of nothing. Well, nature isn't supposed to allow that. So if nature's not able to create itself, how did the universe get here? You can't postulate that that was created by some natural force or you haven't solved the problem, because then, okay, what created that natural force? So the only plausible, it seemed to me, explanation is that there must be some supernatural force that did the creating. And of course, that force would not need to be limited by space or even by time. Oh, now we're getting somewhere. So, all right, let's imagine there is a creator, let's call that creator God, who is supernatural, who's not bounded by space, not bounded by time, and is a pretty darn good mathematician. And it's starting to make some sense here. Well, God must also be an incredible physicist. Because another thing I began to realize by a little more reading is that there is this phenomenal fine-tuning of the universe that makes complexity and therefore life possible. Those of you who study physics and chemistry will know that there's a whole series of laws that govern the behavior of matter and energy. They are simple, beautiful equations, but they have constants in them, like the gravitational constant or the speed of light. And you cannot derive, at the present time, the value of those constants. They are what they are. They're givens. You have to do the experiment and measure them. Well, suppose they were a little different. Would that matter? Would anything change in our universe if the gravitational constant was a little stronger or a little weaker? Some days I think it's a little stronger, but I don't think it really is. So that calculation got done, particularly in the 1970s, by Barrow and Tipler, and the answer was astounding. That if you take any of these 15 constants and you tweak them just a tiny little bit, the whole thing doesn't work anymore. Take gravity, for instance. If gravity was just 1 part in about 10 billion weaker than it actually is, then after the Big Bang, there would be insufficient gravitational pull to result in the coalescence of stars and galaxies and planets and you and me. And you'd end up, therefore, with an infinitely expanding sterile universe. If gravity was just a tiny bit stronger, well, things would coalesce all right, but a little too soon. And the Big Bang would be followed after a while by a big crunch, and we would not have the chance to appear because the timing wouldn't be right. And that's just one example. You can't look at that data and not marvel at it. It is astounding to see the knife edge of improbability upon which our existence exists. So what's that about? Well, I can think of three possibilities. First of all, maybe theory will someday tell us that these constants have to have the value they have, that there is some a priori reason for that. Most physicists I talk to don't think that's too likely. There might be relationships between them that have to be maintained, but not the whole thing. A second possibility, perhaps we are one of an almost infinite series of other universes that have different values of those constants. And of course, we have to be in the one where everything turned out right, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. So that's the multiverse hypothesis, and it is a defensible one as long as you're willing to accept the fact that you will probably never be able to observe those infinite series of other parallel universes. So that requires quite a leap of faith. The third possibility is that this is intentional, that these constants have the value they do because that creator God, who is a good mathematician, also knew that there was an important set of dials to set here if this universe that was coming into being was going to be interesting. So take those three possibilities, and which of them seems most plausible? Apply Occam's razor, if you will, which says that the simplest explanation is most likely correct. Well, I come down on number three, especially because I've already kind of gotten there in terms of the other arguments about the idea of a creator. And this is interesting, but of course, so far, how far have we gotten? We've gotten to Einstein's God now, because Einstein certainly marveled at the way in which mathematics worked. Einstein was not aware, as far as we know, of the fine-tuning arguments at quite this level, but probably would have embraced them in the same way. But we haven't really gotten to a theist God yet. We've gotten to a deist God. So how do we get there? Well, now we come back to Lewis in that first chapter of Mere Christianity, which is called Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And here what is being talked about is the moral law. Now, I didn't take philosophy in college, so I didn't really quite know what this was all about. But as I began to recognize what the argument was, it rang true. It rang true in a really startling way. One of those things where you realize, I've known about this all my life, but I've never really quite thought about it. So what's the argument? The argument is that we humans are unique in the animal kingdom by apparently having a law that we are under, although we seem free to break it because that happens every day. And the law is that there's something called right and there's something called wrong, and we're supposed to do the right thing and not the wrong thing. Again, we break that law. When we do, what do? We make an excuse, which only means we believe the law must be true and we're trying to be let off the hook. Now, people will quickly object, now wait a minute. I can think of human cultures that did terrible things. How can you say they were under the moral law? Well, if you go and study those cultures, you will find out that the things that we consider terrible were in their column called right because of various cultural expectations. So clearly the moral law is universal, but it is influenced in terms of particular actions and how they size up in the right and wrong assessment. Well, the moral law sometimes calls us to do some pretty dramatic things, particularly in terms of altruism, where you do something sacrificial for somebody else. And what about that? People may argue, and they have, and they will continue to, that this can all be explained by evolution, and those are useful arguments to look at. So for instance, if you're being altruistic to your own family, you can see how that might make sense from an evolutionary perspective because they share your DNA. So if you're helping their DNA survive, well, it's yours too. And so that makes sense from a Darwinian argument about reproductive fitness. If you are being nice to somebody in expectation they'll be nice to you later, a reciprocal form of altruism, well, okay, you could see how that might also make sense in terms of benefiting your reproductive success. You can even make arguments, as Martin Nowak has at Harvard, that if you do computer modeling of things like the prisoner's dilemma, you can come up with motivations for entire groups to behave altruistically toward each other. But a consequence of that, and all the other models that have been put together, is that you still have to be hostile to people who are not in your group. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart as far as the evolutionary drive for successful competition. Well, does that fit? Is that what we see in our own experience? Where are those circumstances where we think the moral law has been most dramatically at work? I would submit they are not when we're being just nice to our family, or just nice to people who are going to be nice to us, or even just when we're being nice to other people in our own group. The things that strike us, that cause us to marvel and to say, that's what human nobility is all about, are when that radical altruism extends beyond those categories. When you see Mother Teresa and the streets of Calcutta picking up the dying, when you see Oskar Schindler risking his life to save Jews from the Holocaust, when you see the Good Samaritan, or when you see Wesley Autry. Wesley Autry, a construction worker, African-American, standing on the subway platform in New York City, and next to him, a young man, a graduate student, went into an epileptic seizure. And to the horror of everybody standing there, the student fell onto the tracks in front of an oncoming train. With only a split second to make a decision, Wesley jumped onto the tracks as well, pulled the student, still having the seizure, in that small space in between the tracks, covered him with his own body, and the train rolled over both of them. And miraculously, there was just enough clearance for them both to survive. And here's a picture of the next day, as Wesley describes the situation, standing next to the young man's father. This was clearly radical altruism. These people were of no acquaintance of each other, had no likelihood of seeing each other in any other circumstance, and belonged to different groups as we seem to define them here in our society, one being African American, one being white. And yet, New York went crazy, and they should. What an amazing act. What an amazing, risky thing to do. Now, evolution would say, Wesley, what were you thinking? Talk about ruining your reproductive fitness opportunities. This is a scandal, isn't it? So think about that. Again, I'm not offering you a proof, but I do think when people try to argue that morality can be fully explained on evolutionary grounds, that's a little bit too easy. That's a little bit too much of a just so story, and perhaps it might ought to be thought about as potentially having some other reflected reason for its presence. And I would ask the question, because Lewis asked it in his chapter, if you were looking not just for evidence of a God who was a mathematician and a physicist, but a God who cared about human beings and who stood for what was good and holy and wanted his people to also be interested in what is good and holy, wouldn't it be interesting to find written in your own heart this moral law which doesn't otherwise make sense and which is calling you to do just that? That made a lot of sense to me. So after going through these arguments over the course of a couple of years, and it was that long, fighting them, oftentimes wishing that I had never started down this road because it was leading me a place I wasn't sure I wanted to go, I began to realize that I had a certain series of immutable issues that were leading me in the direction of awe of something greater than myself, reflected here by this phrase from Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. Two things fill me with constantly increasing admiration and awe. The longer and more earnestly I reflect on them, the starry heavens without and the moral law within. My goodness, that's just where I was. But I had to figure out then, okay, if there is the possibility of this kind of God and a God who cares about humans, what is that God really like? And now it was time to go back to the world's religions and try to figure out what they tell us about that. And as I read through them, now somewhat better prepared, I could see there were great similarities between the great monotheistic religions, and they actually resonated quite well with each other about many of the principles, and I found that quite gratifying and was a bit surprised because I had assumed that they were radically different. But there were differences. Now, about this time, I had also arrived at a point that was actually not comforting, which was the realization that if the moral law was a pointer to God, and if God was good and holy, I was not. And as much as I tried to forgive myself for actions that were not consistent with that moral law, they kept popping up. And therefore, just as I was beginning to perceive the person of God in this sort of blurry way, that image was receding because of my own failures. And I began to despair of whether this would ever be a relationship that I could claim or hope to have because of my own shortcomings. And into that area of increasing anxiety came the realization that there is a person in one of these faiths who has the solution to that. And that's the person of Jesus Christ, who not only claimed to know God, but to be God, and who in this amazing and incomprehensible at first, but ultimately incredibly sensible, uplifting, sacrificial act, died on the cross and then rose from the dead to provide this bridge between my imperfections and God's holiness in a way that made more sense than I ever dreamed it could. I had heard those phrases about Christ died for your sins, and I thought that was so much gibberish, and suddenly it wasn't gibberish at all. And so, 2 years after I began this journey, on a hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains up in Oregon, with my mind cleared of those distractions that so often get in the way of realizing what is really true and important, I felt I had reached the point where I no longer had reasons to resist, and I didn't want to resist. I had a hunger to give in to this. And so that day, I became a Christian. That was 31 years ago. And I was scared, and I was afraid I was going to turn into somebody very somber and lose my sense of humor and probably be called to Africa the next week or something. But instead, I discovered this great sense of peace and a joyfulness about having finally crossed that bridge. And also to have done so in a fashion that seemed to live up to my hopes that faith would not be something you had to plunge into blindly, but something where there was, in fact, reason behind the decision.